Well, thank you. I'm really happy to be here, and I've really been enjoying the presentations. I've been a professor of public health for 35 years, so the notion that a lot of people are talking about public health is very gratifying to me, and hopefully I can answer some of the questions. Some of the things that have come up that I think my presentation will shed light on is one of the points that was made: with so many people touched by traffic deaths, why so little outrage? And I think I will touch on that. Sweden has great success. Why not us in the United States? And I think that's another issue that will come up through my presentation. How can we focus on this as a public health issue? Well, obviously I'm going to talk about that. And then most importantly, I think, is why do we blame the victim? So I'm going to talk to you about that because my presentation really is about cultural values, but in the broadest possible way. It's about American values. It's not about subgroup values, because all these subgroup values are linked to these larger American values. So this is a cartoon. This is a doctor coming out of the ICU area. Obviously, this woman's husband has just died. She's distraught. The doctor comes out. He says, "I was able to get in one last lecture about diet and exercise." And this is the default message in the United States. The default message is it's all about the individual, it's all about personal responsibility, and the election of different behaviors is a moral decision. And when you make a moral decision about your behavior, you have to accept the consequences. So what we try and do in this sense, there's this notion with this very strong default approach that if we can just get the right message in the right way to the right person at the right time, they will change. And if they all change, then the problem goes away. Unfortunately, it's never happened. The history of public communication campaigns around public health in this country is dismal. I wish it were easy to change behavior. I wish that so many of the things we read about really worked and were so efficient as we sometimes are led to believe, but the fact is they don't. And it's because behavior, as we heard in one of the previous presentations, is enormously complex. It's not rocket science. It ends up to be more difficult than rocket science. So here's an alternative view. The alternative view is here's somebody going down a highway. They're looking at all these signs. Here's a headline in the paper: 6 in 10 Americans overweight. And they're seeing Jack in the Box, KFC, Taco Bell, so forth. And one person in the car says to the other, by the way, notice none of them are neither is texting nor is anybody on a cell phone. But they're talking to each other, and one says, weapons of mass expansion. Now, this is a fundamentally different worldview from the cartoon we saw before. But these cartoons represent the fundamental tension that we have in the United States about the nature of behavior, the nature of social responsibility, and how we go about things. And it's not an either-or thing, by the way. We're balancing these things. But when we primarily focus on the individual, we have an information-rich strategy. When we focus on the environment, we have a policy-oriented strategy. One of the great advances in public health over the years has not been changing individual behavior, but has been changing the policy environment in which behaviors take place. And this is a very important thing to remember. Now, one of the things that I want to impress on you is we have narratives in our society that drive this, that drive how we think about the relationship between the individual and the society, how responsibility is distributed, and who's supposed to do what to get what benefits. And I don't know, how many of you have ever seen the yo-yos and the wits or heard of Jared Bernstein? Jared Bernstein is now Vice President Biden's senior economic advisor. He was Obama's advisor during the campaign. And Jared wrote a book, and in it he talked about the yo-yos and the wits. The yo-yos are those who believe you're on your own. The wits are those who believe we're in this together. Now again, we incorporate both of these perspectives, but the national narrative over the past 30 years has really been a yo-yo narrative. Now, the importance of that is whoever captures that narrative, public policy follows. So what we've had over the past 30 years is a narrative of you're on your own, which has led to a series of public policies which are essentially designed to free up individuals to pursue their own self-interest really in as unregulated an environment as possible. Because part of this is The government, rather than being here to help you, and I know you are here to help us, but the government, rather than being here to help you, is here to get in your way, to make things more difficult, and to make things more ineffective. And I'm going to go on with that a little later because I think this is one of the fundamental values we face. The wits are those who believe we're in this together. Most of us are probably on the side of the wits, although we also believe very strongly in the values around the yo-yos. But public health is a wit thing. Public health believes you cannot be healthy in an unhealthy environment, that everybody's health is linked to everybody else's health, which is linked to the environment of public policies. So we are constantly struggling with this thing in more recent years, the last, since the 2006 election, we're much more moving a little bit more on this pendulum swing toward a we're in this together kind of narrative that will begin to be reflected by policies that are more wit than yo-yo oriented. Now, one of the other things in the United States, and by the way, I want to congratulate the previous speaker, John Lee, because I've heard a lot of metaphors, but I've never heard as interesting a metaphor as termite mounds as culture. And I'm going to remember that one, you know? It's like what you'll remember a week from now is when somebody says to you, how was that meeting? You'll say, well, there was some guy there from Oprah. Don't know what he said, but he was on Oprah. And I'm going to say to somebody, you know, there was this guy, I don't remember his name now, but he said termite mounds are the equivalent of culture and that we can understand culture. So I'm going to remember that. But one of the great metaphors we have in the United States is the beating the odds metaphor, right? Don't we love it when when people go out and they beat the odds? And again, this is a variation of the yo-yos and the wits. Go out and beat the odds. Well, unfortunately, for everybody who beats the odds, many people lose to the odds. So one of the things we need to think about is changing this odds metaphor to beating the odds to we as decision makers, policy makers, and so forth need to think about how do we change the odds. So beating the odds means that few people can be successful, but they really can work hard and some can overcome these things. Changing the odds means creating an environment, mostly through policy, that allows more people to be successful. In effect, it reasserts the ladder of opportunity in the United States and strengthens the rung so more people can move up. Now, we have some questionable beliefs, and we've had some of these today. Dee Alsop, I think, touched on this first one. There's this notion that the facts will set you free. If you only knew how bad something was for you, if we could only get people to see the statistics, they would change. This doesn't happen. Facts are necessary but not sufficient because we are a values-driven society, and I'm going to be getting much more into that. A second one is the data speak for themselves. Now, do we have any epidemiologists in this room? You know, I'm not an epidemiologist, but a lot of them are my friends, and like me, they've never heard data speak, but an epidemiologist will be very honest with you and say, however, if you torture the data long enough, you can get them to confess to anything. And I think we need to realize that data don't speak, data are interpreted. How many times have you worked with groups, or has your group, I know I've worked with a lot of groups who says, we got a new study, let's go to the state legislature, let's go to the Congress, let's go to the school board, and let's show them this study. Because now that they have the facts, the data are there, they'll see it and they'll change. Well, how many times have you seen the same study used by opposite groups to argue opposite points? This is not objective stuff. We look at this through a value lens. I'm not going to go through this other stuff, but again, don't get caught in this notion of we just need a catchier message or slogan, or don't diminish the values of the other side who might come out and oppose a lot of policies that we in this room might want, because there is a very strong moral, rational perspective that underlies lots of these perspectives that we often think don't make a lot of sense. Now, I just want to talk for a second about public health. The mission of public health is to fulfill society's interest in assuring conditions in which people can be healthy. Now, this is a very broad mandate and a very important mandate. It's not just about information and education. It's about creating an environment and structuring it through public policies that allow people to make healthier decisions. Nancy Milio, a professor of public policy at University of North Carolina, used to say, what we want to do is we want to create an environment where health damaging choices are difficult as possible to make, and health promoting choices are as easy as possible to make. And what have we done? Whether it's traffic safety or these other areas of public health and safety, we've actually reversed that. We have a system where health damaging choices are the easiest ones to make, and there's reasons for that. I'm going to skip over the upstream, downstream thing. I think most people have probably heard that that's my favorite metaphor rather than the termite mound, but upstream, downstream is pretty potent because basically it just says we've got to stop pulling people out of the water and trying to resuscitate them, go upstream, see why they're coming in. So if we go upstream, what does the environment look like there? And this is what we need to think about. What would be the policies if we were going to create a society, a community, that was marked by having the lowest possible traffic fatality rates? What would that look like? How would we reduce the health damaging choices through these policies, and what kind of policies would we have to increase health promoting choices? Oh, this is the audience participation part of the presentation. So everybody needs to take a minute now, look at that. Tell me what that says. What's that say? Yeah, of course that's what it says, but unfortunately this is what it really says. Now, this is what I really want to talk to you about today. This is one of the things I've worked with a number of cognitive linguists, and I've become very interested in the notion of framing and values and how framing and values underlie our discussion of public health policies. What I did was I showed you some cues. Those cues were the top of letters. You looked at the cues I gave you and you said, obviously that says rural traffic safety, but it said something totally differently. You have a mental model in your head that you brought to what I showed you. There are no blank slates. So much of communication is based on the notion that people are a blank slate, and if we just give them the right information, they'll respond. So we come to these issues with mental models that we use to interpret these things. So I want to give you an example of this. I got a newer one I'm going to show you in a minute. This is an old one. This is a story from the New York Times. And it was about how even when you do polling that tries to be objective, you still get different kinds of responses to the question when it's worded slightly differently. The public's desire for tax cuts can be hard to measure. Pollsters asking what should be done with the nation's budget surplus. Now, you may not understand this term, budget surplus. This was an old-fashioned term that was happening around the year 2000. Now, here's the thing. I must have done this presentation with this particular thing 50 times before I finally read budget surplus, and I said, I've been framed. How was I framed? Well, there was no budget surplus in the year 2000. We had 37 million people without health insurance. We had a crumbling infrastructure of highways and bridges and stuff like that. We had massive educational problems. Why would there be a budget surplus? And then I thought, Bill Clinton, he's a Democrat. If I say to you, Democrat, what do you say back to me? Tax and spend liberals, right? And Clinton was trying to do this new Democrat third way. He was trying to establish the Democratic Party as the fiscally responsible party. By the way, talk about facts frames trump facts. Forget your political orientation. All the evidence shows that budget deficits, maybe up until this point in history, but budget deficits always expand much greater under Republican administrations than Democrat administrations. But do we believe that? None of us in this room would believe it because of the tax and spend liberals. So anyway, Clinton was trying to change that. So it was a framing technique to generate this socially constructed notion of a surplus. Anyway, the question was, should the money be used for a tax cut or should it be used to fund new government programs? Now, this is what the question really was. Should we give you your money back to do with whatever you want because you worked hard to earn that money, or should we flush it down the toilet? What do you think we ought to do with that? Think carefully now. 60% wanted the tax cut. The other 40% must have been public health people, but at least 25% wanted the new programs. Now we change it just a bit. Same thing, should the money be used for a tax cut, or should it be spent on programs for education, the environment, healthcare, crime fighting, and military defense? What are those? Those are government programs. 22%, about a third, now want the tax cut. 69%, 2.5 times, more than 2.5 times, want the programs. Why is that? What is the fundamental difference in the way these two questions are asked? One of them uses the term government, the other doesn't. Government is like behind that blue box, it's a cue. When you hear the word government, you think waste, fraud, abuse, giving people something for nothing, using my tax dollars to benefit somebody else, taking away my freedom and liberty. That's what you think. That's the cue. Now, government is an important partner in anything we do to improve the public health, the public safety, and to protect the society. We cannot be successful unless we can rehabilitate this notion of government. And by the way, there's some excellent framing and cognitive science research going on exactly how to do that. Now, this is a more recent quote, but just to show you, John Boehner on healthcare reform. This was a healthcare reform bill, okay? This is healthcare. He said, this bill is the greatest threat to freedom that I have seen in the 19 years I've been here in Washington. It's going to be a government takeover. Government takeover, you know what that means. It's like all the people for motor vehicles are now going to shift from there, and they're going to start working on healthcare. Of our healthcare system with tens of thousands of new bureaucrats, my God. Is there a dirtier word to the population than saying new bureaucrats? But that's not the worst of it. They're right down the street. Are you crazy? And they're making decisions for you. My God. But this was a healthcare bill. But here's the thing. You could take these words about any bill, not almost any bill, let's say, because these are the enduring values that hang on over time. So these are the tension that we have in our society, a historic tension, a 234-year plus tension where we're constantly fighting what's the right balance. Now, I'm not going to go over all of these, but we heard some of these. Shared responsibility. Nobody's off the hook. Everybody has a responsibility for doing something about the problem. But we have to make sure that distribution of responsibility is fair. You can't put the heaviest burden of responsibility on those who have the least resources and benefit the least from the existence of the problem, which is often what we do. That's the blaming the victim. But we're up against the set of values: self-determination, self-discipline, rugged individualism, autonomy. I mean, you think about that quote from Boehner. What was that talking about? What were some of the things? Autonomy versus paternalism. Freedom versus the nanny state. Personal responsibility. I'm in control. We've heard these things before. So, again, I can spend an hour just going over these values, but the thing we have to realize from the social justice versus more of a market justice dominant values, there's a shared responsibility. Fates are interconnected. There's an obligation to the collective good. The community benefit thing that Dee mentioned is a good example of trying to make that, but it's a difficult argument to make because people don't typically identify their good as connected to the community benefit. They don't see that as something that is often motivating. Anyway, these are, in this side, it's a limited obligation to collective good. So we're trying to constantly balance these values. Social accountability versus personal responsibility. In the United States of America, compared to other countries, we are much more heavily weighted toward personal responsibility rather than social accountability. So one of the exercises I do with groups when we're talking about this is the after all challenge. Now this gets to the community benefit thing. The after all challenge basically, for example, we were working with a group trying to get more support for childcare. And we worked with them, we said, what you need to do is you need to argue with us and explain why I should care, meaning people without kids and so forth, about your kid. In other words, what's the community benefit? It ends up that's hard to do. So we call it the after all challenge. So this is an example of what we might do. Traffic crashes and the resultant injuries and fatalities are a significant problem for rural communities. Of course people should be educated about safe driving and encouraged to be better drivers, because that's always got to be the base of what you put out there. But education may be necessary, but it isn't sufficient to really reduce this problem. After all. And what happens when you get to after all is people go through this thing. First, they say, after all, 40,000 people die every year. But we know that's not a very good argument. The second place they go is, after all, we've got programs that we know work, because we're all in the process of selling programs to some extent. But that doesn't work very well. It's the third thing, after all, that gets this community benefit. Why should I care about it? Why is it important to us as a society? What are those social values? And that's where we need to focus. And this is actually a very hard thing to do. So to conclude, what we need to do is we need to travel to the upstream territory. We need to look at those policies that currently make health damaging choices easy and modify those or eliminate them. And we need to create policies or reinforce existing policies that make health promoting choices easier to make. We need to advance research-based policy for change, obviously, otherwise we're just assuming that we know what's best. So we need to continue with the research. We need to identify research-based policy. We need to rebalance our stories to reflect policy issues in the upstream terrain. This means coming up with new metaphors. You know, there's a wonderful quote, old quote, very old, that said, I think it can go back to Plato, although it's been variations in time. If you can tell a nation's stories, you don't have to worry about who makes its laws, because the stories reflect the values. And the stories go very deep. And right now, our stories are really more promoted toward risk and individualism, extreme individualism in many cases, than this collective type of thing. The final thing is we need to root our stories in the community and in social justice values, because those values are the things that are motivated. I'll leave you with a final quote from Thomas Pynchon. Anybody ever read anything by Thomas Pynchon? Okay, I knew you would from the questions you've been asking. I knew you were a Pynchon guy. So there's a quote Thomas Pynchon had. It said, if you can get him asking the wrong questions, the answers don't matter. And we really need to think about that. If you can get them asking the wrong questions, the answers don't matter. So much of what we do is distracted into areas that are narrow disciplinary focused. And by the way, I got that quote, and I went out and bought the book because somebody gave me the quote. The book is it's from Gravity's Rainbow. It's about 700 pages. I started reading that book to find that quote because I'm an academic, right? I have to validate it. I have to find the real quote. And anybody who knows Pynchon knows by the time I got to page 40, even if I saw the quote, I wouldn't identify it because you just get lost in this. So I did what anybody would do. I got a graduate student. Said, I gotta find this quote. And sure enough, this was 7 years ago. Graduate student Googles the entire quote, and like in 1/300th of a second comes up with 300,000 references. There's dozens of websites. And it was actually in a part of the book that was called Parables for Paranoids. So if one thing we can do through all our discussion is maybe we can refocus our questions and make sure we're asking the right questions so we can make progress on this issue that continues to plague us with death and disability, and that we can do a lot better job on. Thank you.